Good evening, everyone. Welcome to StartSpace. My name is Roberto Daniele. I'm the senior programmer here at StartSpace, State Library of Victoria. Welcome to another Inventors Innovators series, where every month we pick apart an industry, we choose an industry, and we look at some exciting funders doing exciting stuff in the field. So the industry for tonight is SpaceTech. And before I welcome the panel and the moderators, I would like to give a brief acknowledgement of country. The State Library of Victoria acknowledges the traditional lands of all Victorian Aboriginal clans and their cultural practices and knowledge systems. We recognise that the State Collection holds traditional cultural knowledge belonging to Indigenous communities in Victoria and around the country. We support communities to protect the integrity of this information gathered from their ancestors in the colonial period. We pay our respects to the elders, past and present, who have handed down these systems of practice to each new generation for millennia. So, welcome everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to the Usman Iftikhar, who is the moderator for tonight. Usman is a man of many hats. He's an award-winning systems entrepreneur, passionate about utilizing the power of entrepreneurship to collectively solve global problems such as global climate emergency and the global refugee crisis. He's a co-founder of Space Without Borders, a new space media and community startup on a mission to democratize space for everyone. He's an International Space University Executive Program alumnus and a Singularity University Global Solutions Program Fellow. And a Hillary Foundation Fellow, and has been the head of partnerships for SpaceBase for the last 3 years. Usman also previously worked with the Aussie Industry Entrepreneurs Program, providing guidance to startups to access up to 1 million match grant funding, including those focused on space tech. Additionally, remember, man of many hats, Usman has been active community builder and mentor to the Australian tech startup ecosystem, and previously co-founded Catalysr, an award-winning startup incubator for migrants and refugees, which has supported over 800 migrapreneurs since 2016, with a few focused on space tech. One of them is here, by the way. Usman is also currently a venture partner at Backbone Partners, which is an early-stage VC fund for immigrant entrepreneurs in Australia. So, Usman, over to you. And this is, I should say, this is the abridged version of Usman's CV. It reads for about another 3 pages, and I can guarantee you that all of them are amazing. So, Usman, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Roberto, and welcome everyone. It is truly a privilege and an honor to be here. As Roberto mentioned, I'm the co-founder for an organization called Space Without Borders. I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land across Australia and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to welcome any First Nations people that are joining us today as well. And particularly, we know that First Nations people have been our first innovators and navigators who have truly set us on this journey of looking at the stars and understanding, space. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants. We've got a lot of contemporary space tech that's happening, but we truly have to thank our First Nations people and recognize the amazing work they've done in sort of protecting this land and sort of sustaining them as well. In terms of Space Without Borders, it's a new social enterprise that is working to support the ecosystem builders in the space tech ecosystem. So talking about that, we've got some fantastic ecosystem builders here today who are doing incredible work in genuinely building a more inclusive space tech ecosystem. But not only that, they're also creating a huge global impact. So I'm not going to go into detail and tell their story, but I would love for you to get to hear from them firsthand. They will tell a bit about themselves, and then I have a few questions prepared that I would love to ask both of them. Once that's done, I would also love to get some questions from you in the audience. So as you're listening to Emeline and Taofiq, who are both of the amazing panelists that are joining us today, please type some chats in the comments because we'll be able to see your comments, and then any kind of questions that you have, we'll be able to answer them. So before we get started, I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that SpaceTech is something that, again, has a lot of history in Australia specifically, starting from the 1950s and 60s. But then there has been a rejuvenation of sorts in the last probably 5 years, particularly as the Australian Space Agency was established in 2017. And we've really seen a lot of innovation happening. Both of these individuals that are joining us today have had a huge role to play in building that space tech ecosystem. So without further ado, would love to hear from you, Emeline, around your story. Why are you doing space tech and why are you here today?
Thanks so much, Usman, and kia ora, everyone. Greetings from New Zealand. I am, I guess, beaming in from Auckland. So let's see, a little bit of a background. I'm originally from the Philippines, and that kind of like moved around all over the place before I immigrated to the US about maybe 25 years ago. My background is in physics and space science, but really worked more on program development, operations, educational management over the last 3 decades. But worked on space startup companies, from space tourism all the way to startup companies that are actually building like landers and rovers on the moon. I also work for the International Space University, of which I am an alumni, and also Singularity University as well, that was based at NASA Ames in Silicon Valley. But about like 6 years ago, I basically found out about this Edmund Hillary Fellowship Program, of which Usman is also a fellow. It's for entrepreneurs and investors to come to New Zealand, work on a project that could scale. I've been a passionate basically advocate of space since I was like really young. I'm pretty old. Like I was born during the Apollo era when we were basically sending humans to the moon. And for me, having lived in the developing world, but then having also the opportunity to kind of like transcend that and have all of these abundant kind of opportunities that I've had over 3 decades, I want to make sure that I'm not just an odd one out, that if we are to actually create a sustainable global space industry and economy, that we need to make sure that we bring everyone along with us. And so that is my passion and my purpose. And so that's why when I moved to New Zealand, my husband and I, who is also a space person, we co-founded SpaceBase. And basically SpaceBase wants to shrink that gap between spacefaring nations and the rest of the world, to have that opportunity to actually be involved in space. And so what we've done over this like 5 to 6 years is really look at the different ways of how do you create ecosystems. So essentially we call ourselves space enablers, and that's what we've been doing over the past, where we look at education, innovation, and community building in all of the things that we do. So maybe I'll just stop there, and we can talk more about what we've been doing so far.
Thank you so much for joining us, Emeline. And Emeline has been really humble in sort of sharing the work she's doing. She's absolutely incredible, and has had loads of experience in this sector, for the last few decades. I've also been really privileged to call Emeline a mentor, and I've had the chance to work with SpaceBase as well. Over to you, Taofiq. We'd love to hear your story, what you're doing in this sector, and what are you doing to build the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you, Usman, and fantastic to hear from you, Emeline. Always an amazing story. My name is Taofiq, CEO and founder of Spiral Blue. So I guess my personal story is came to Australia at just 5 years of age with my parents. Many years ago at this point. which was really a very key moment in my life, obviously. Let's just say I would not be able to be doing what I'm doing now if I was still in Bangladesh. But, those roots still stay with me. I often go back, and I do often, we are looking at what we can do, not just for, wealthy nations like Australia and the United States and Europe, but also for the poorer nations like Bangladesh, like the Philippines, I suppose, and other parts of the world as well. And so Spiral Blue is really the culmination of my personal interest as a young, much younger child, let's just say, in space and science fiction and Star Wars and this sort of thing. And really looking to see where, okay, sure, we could try to build the future, but what are the actual steps to reach that point? And so one of the original things that we're looking at was actually something as it sounds pretty ridiculous, but the thought was, could we spot pirate ships from space, right? And yet pirate ships are still a thing. It's sad to say. There was a documentary on one recently. Thankfully, the pirates got caught soon after that was released. But still, they are still a problem today. They are hounding the oceans, causing issues for many users of the seas. And so, being able to track these would be quite valuable. And we developed some methods to do this, but as we went about that process and we were looking at, okay, how do we do this on a scalable basis using satellite technology, AI, these sorts of things, we realized very quickly that there were technologies not just on the software side, but also on the hardware side that we needed to develop as well. And we ended up developing what we call the Space Edge computer, essentially a dedicated server almost, or a supercomputer that you can put on board a satellite and then have it run AI in space. In terms of what we're doing with it, we are actually processing imagery in order to pull clouds out of images. Turns out when you're trying to image the Earth for many different industries, whether it be for trying to spot pirates or whether it be for more boring but still valuable use cases such as for agriculture or emergency services or for city planning, most of the Earth is covered with clouds. So if you can just pull the clouds out of the image, that's extremely valuable. But we can go a step further as well. We can actually use AI processes to work with images and pull out the parts of the images that are most valuable for the user. The example I like to give is if we think about weather, weather meteorologists collect data from many different sources, whether it be from weather stations, satellites, many different sources. They put it into a supercomputer down in Melbourne, I believe, and then it churns out a nice little prediction. And nowadays you can go onto Google or AccuWeather or whatever weather app you may have and just get a nice prediction as to what the temperature is going to be in 27 hours from now, right? It's pretty incredible. But ultimately, it's all that data is then converted into a useful, actionable insight. That's the part that people ultimately don't see, that all that work being done in the background. And that's what we're trying to achieve with satellite imagery, with Earth observation, so that we can deliver outcomes for many different industries, including for addressing climate change as well. And so that's Spiral Blue. I guess one thing I will note as well is as a startup founder, it can be quite difficult to kick off. So I'm very excited to get further into the story with some of the questions that we have coming up, and very excited to get questions from the audience as well.
Thank you so much, Taofiq, for sharing your story. And what I'll add is I've had the privilege to meet Taofiq back in 2018 when Spiral Blue was just kicking off, where Taofiq participated in one of the incubator programs I was running for immigrant entrepreneurs called Catalysr. So it has been incredible to see your journey ever since. And thank you for doing all the fantastic work you do. Particularly, AI is the hype now, but looking at, how AI can solve many different challenges, particularly from space, I think is really exciting. So would love to learn more, and then obviously, get you to share more of your story. Coming back to you, Emeline, I think personally, for me, you are my inspiration in getting into the work that I'm doing around trying to democratize that access to space. But I'd love to hear from you around who's your inspiration or who's your biggest inspiration, and why is that for you?
Yeah, great question. So I've had, I guess, many inspirations over the extent of my life. But I guess one thing that I probably would want to highlight that has inspired me, and also somebody that has given me a lot of the opportunities that I've had over decades, basically, is Peter Diamandis. So Peter Diamandis is a space visionary, and I guess some people might know him from like different stages or the different companies that he's actually created over decades. One is that, for one, he founded the International Space University. He founded X Prize Foundation, which was the genesis of the Ansari X Prize. So this was way back in the 2000s when there was a prize, a $10 million prize for actually the first private company that could actually send humans to space and back and do it again, and which would then spurred sort of like the private industry. He also founded Singularity University, which is like focused on leveraging exponential technologies to solve global grand challenges on Earth. And then he also founded Space Adventures, which is essentially the first space tourism company. So there's been a lot of like private citizens that have gone into space like in the past maybe 2 years, but actually the very first private citizen went up like 20 years ago already, like 2001. It's even more than 20 years. And why I really get inspired by Peter is that, for one, he has this vision of what the future should be, and doesn't get faced with all of the minutia of the impossibilities of things. So just one example is that when the X Prize Foundation was founded back in like 1996, and he announced it to the world, he had, it was supposed to be a $10 million prize, where there should be teams that will be competing for this prize, and he announced it with no money and basically no teams. But he always said that you have to create this basically a line of super credibility by actually bringing along people that would potentially like help you in your endeavor. And so during that announcement, he had, I think, 10 astronauts on stage, and the director of NASA and so forth. So basically he's never faced with what can't be done, and uses and basically brings along people and inspires them to all of the things that he needed to kind of like do. And so for me, all of the companies that I've actually been involved so far have all been founded by Peter. So I wouldn't be here without him. So I guess he's just one person to look into. He's written the books like Bold and Abundance, which are basically bestsellers. And so check him out.
Thank you, Emeline. And thank you for mentioning Peter. I had the privilege of also meeting him back in 2017 when I did an SU program. An absolutely incredible individual, and you're absolutely right. His sort of story of just getting started and doing stuff, and then letting things happen, and they do happen, has just been incredibly inspiring. So thank you for talking about him and all the amazing work that he's already done. Taofiq, coming to you, who has been your biggest inspiration in this sort of sector and generally?
I think unfortunately, the reality is in this sector, you can't really look past Elon Musk. He has some very severe character flaws, especially nowadays. But if you look at what he has done for the space sector since the beginning of founding SpaceX, to being the company that I believe is still the lowest cost to their first successful launch. You look at other companies, they've raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Virgin Orbit spent, I think, more than $1 billion to get to their first successful launch of a rocket to orbit. Elon Musk and SpaceX did it under 100 million. It's honestly incredible. And obviously, these are very lofty figures that we're talking about, but it still shows that the values that he ran SpaceX under, at least at that time, and I'd argue still does, being very lean, having always having that focus on the long-term vision of making humanity a multiplanetary species, not necessarily having, we don't all have to have necessarily a vision as lofty as that, of course, but always being laser focused on that, and then always being cost conscious and running in a very lean manner, but then also having that focus to make sure that you do have that product development and that customer development happening together, so that customers are almost iteratively getting new products and new services from, we were talking about launch services, of course, so I mean, he's really selling rockets, but even in that situation, they were always, every single rocket they have launched, as far as I'm aware, I believe this is still the case. At this point, this is hundreds of different rockets. Every rocket that they have launched has been very slightly different in some way, as they have been essentially A/B testing the laws of physics in order to understand what is the best way to build, launch, and recover rockets to reduce the cost of reaching orbit. So yeah, Elon Musk, SpaceX, I think are definitely my number one inspirations, and certainly around in late 2015 when they really landed their first rocket from space, the first Falcon 9 that came back and landed at landing zone 1. That was a massive wake-up call for me that, oh, okay, wow, space is not just the domain of big space agencies or very big companies. This is something that is actually an area that startups can get into as well. And so that's been incredible. I would also like to mention, of course, Dr. Jason Held, the CEO of Sabre Astronautics, who is another inspiration of mine. His persistence in the face of continuous criticism and continuous, people trying to take him down has been incredible over the last, 15, almost 20 years that he's been in the space business. He was one of the very first people to found a space company, a space startup in Australia, and actually stick to the space part. There's no shortage of companies that have, founded or started up with the idea of doing space, and then they've gone into consulting or working with defense or working in some random, piece of software that has nothing to do with their original vision. And sure, if the goal of doing a business is to make money, that's understandable. Personally, that's not how I see it. I see money as a tool for doing impactful things. But if it's just money for the sake of money, that's fine. But if you want to build something incredible that has an impact on the planet and on the people around you, you need to have that focus, that persistence, that drive. So I think, Elon Musk as the sort of very big inspiration, and Dr. Jason Held as a smaller but still very important inspiration as well. Jason especially has been an ongoing mentor of ours for many years, ever since, even before we started Spiral Blue. So I would definitely want to thank him, and hopefully he'll be in Sydney sometime so I can buy him a drink at some point. So fingers crossed.
Thank you so much, Taofiq, for mentioning. And obviously, what you and Elon share is that we both come from immigrant backgrounds, and so that's something to speak about. The amazing work that immigrant entrepreneurs do. And this is obviously a topic that's really close to my heart, being an immigrant myself. But one thing that you mentioned was, SpaceX and some of the great work they're doing in terms of reusable rockets and so on. Obviously, for many people who are not part of the space tech ecosystem, when they think about space tech, they often see it as either government agencies or really large kind of businesses, such as SpaceX, who are looking to create big breakthroughs or scientific discoveries, or like billion-dollar projects, like space tourism or colonization of Mars, etc. So really, I guess for an average person, something that it's hard for them to grasp of how can they actually get involved. And so but I think personally, and then obviously both of you know this, that there's so many different ways in which you can solve problems on Earth using space technology, and particularly create a social and environmental impact. So Taofiq, I'm just going to reverse the order and start with you this time, and ask you, what do you think about that, and if you've got any thoughts on what you're doing in that space to be able to help create impact, and use space technology for good on the planet.
Well, look, I think any discussion on conservation or sustainability or anything like this needs to consider the fact that the environment is not limited to the Earth, right? We need to consider the fact that there is a universe around us. The Earth is only a very, very small part of it. And we can consider that, yes, as far as we can tell, the universe appears to be lifeless, but that may not always be the case. We might find other life out there, which certainly is probably not something on most people's expectations anytime soon, but it's probably going to happen. I'd say that's my personal belief anyway. If you look at the some of the discourse around the Fermi paradox, there's a lot of debate around this, but my personal belief is that it's going to happen at some point. Not necessarily talking about intelligent life. We could dig a hole on Mars somewhere at some point and find that there's some sort of life similar to bacteria, perhaps. But what this does mean is that if we see that space is, quote unquote, dead, we have an incredible opportunity to not only we have the opportunity to preserve the Earth by not necessarily clamping down on all human activity, making sure that no one ever does anything that's harmful to the Earth, which, obviously we want to minimize these activities anyway, because it's good to do that, and it's economical. It is economical to recycle, it is economical to reuse, it is economical to use renewable energy, and it is economical to do work for the environment, because it ultimately pays itself back eventually, right? I think every economic study that's done shows that is the case. But in the meantime, what that means is not that we should necessarily clamp down, reduce the growth of human activity, reduce the usage of different types of transportation. We need to use technologies to find ways to overcome these problems. And so that ultimately what we will what we'll see for ourselves and for our planet is that humanity will be able to leave the planet. Not all of us, of course. I'd be very happy to stay on the Earth in that situation. And I would also be very happy to commute to a local space station, or maybe to the moon at some point, do some work there, then come back to the Earth. But in that situation, I want the Earth to be a paradise, a garden, essentially for humanity, for all the life that we currently know exists in the universe. I want our planet to be a garden. And I believe the technologies we are developing around remote sensing, communications, obviously spatial technologies such as navigation, GPS, all of these sorts of things are being used across multiple sectors for conservation, for looking after our planet, for sustainability, for addressing climate change. And ultimately, but simultaneously, these technologies are also the same ones that are going to get us off the Earth. So it's a huge win-win in my book, and this is exactly what we are doing at Spiral Blue, and what we have been doing since the company was founded, to build the technologies using the space technologies that can help take care of the Earth, so that when we do leave the planet, we can leave it as a garden.
Thank you so much, Taofiq. And then I've written down "Leaving Earth as a Garden." I think that's a beautiful sentiment, and something that definitely we can all think about. Before I go to you, Emeline, for anyone who's listening in the audience, just wanted to repeat that if you've got any questions as you're listening to this, from the Fermi paradox to really utilizing space tech for good, please put it in the comments as well, so that we can see and we can ask those questions. So Emeline, I know you've worked in this sector specifically around using space technologies for good, specifically using even incentive challenges and sort of prizes. So I would love for you to sort of share a bit more about the work you were doing, your sort of general thoughts, but then specifically about the work you're doing in the sector as well.
Yeah, thanks again, and to add to what Taofiq is saying, that we often basically take for granted, what space data can do basically for planet Earth. I mean, today there are, hundreds of satellites that are basically orbiting around the Earth that are specifically, looking looking at the pulse and health of planet Earth. That's really what the Earth observation satellites are doing today, either from weather to basically illegal fishing to precision agriculture for better production, but especially climate change. I think most people probably don't realize that over 90% of the climate change monitoring is actually done by satellites today. So it's really, really important technology that is helping us understand what's happening today. And so for us at SpaceBase, one of the things that we really focus on is really leveraging the space technology to address climate issues. And so for the past, I guess, since 2019, I mean, we've been delivering space competitions. We started out like in New Zealand first, but then we've then broadened it, and now we're calling it Space for Planet Earth Challenge. What we've done is like every time that we do this is like there's a different theme. So for example, from the past 2021, 2022, we focused on carbon sequestration and then coral health. This time around, we just launched the new Space for Planet Earth Challenge, and the focus is on identification of methane emissions on Earth. And this challenge is actually open to New Zealand, Australia, the Pacific Islands, and the Philippines. And it's like two categories. It's for high school and then also for university and startups. And it's like I guess what you can think of it as a really long hackathon, because it is delivered over around like 8 months, where the first part of is to basically down select teams that will go into this online incubator. And we do this so that the teams can actually be mentored and advised towards what they're going to submit at the end of that incubator for the final applications. And that stage will then select for the finalists that will eventually participate in the actual pitch and demo session in March of 2024. The challenge has like some cash prize awards. And so for the university startup, it's about $25,000 New Zealand. And then for the high school, it's about $8,000 as well. And so we do this challenges because we actually think that there is a way for innovators out there, especially in the region, to actually help already existing research and development in the particular area of focus, of which this time around it's methane. And it also during the incubator period, even if you actually just get and to participate into the incubator and not even get into the finals, it's already a way to basically learn some skills and some training on how to do remote sensing, to do data analysis. And then at the same time, we also go through this innovation process of teaching the teams from design thinking to rapid prototyping, product market fit, all the way to actually your pitching. So this is one great opportunity, I think, for students and startups to now already potentially be part of the space industry by just entering into the competition. So again, that's just like one aspect of the things that we're kind of like doing right now with SpaceBase.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Emeline. And when you get a chance, we'd love for you to sort of pop that into the chat as well, so we can, for anyone in the comments, so anyone who wants to go and have a look at the link, they can. I'm seeing some questions coming in the comments as well, so I'll ask those in a couple of minutes. But I've got a couple of questions that I'm really eager to learn more about. Taofiq, sort of would love to know about you and your experience, particularly as you've sort of been building your SpaceTech startup for the last few years. How's your journey been building Spiral Blue, and like what would you sort of recommend aspiring founders, like who should they speak to as they want to get involved in this sector?
Well, I think in terms of there's definitely a lot to say with regards to Spiral Blue. Oh boy, it's our 50th year of business. We have had a lot of achievements in this time, of course, as well as many challenges, which I will talk about. I think just to get to, I guess, a recommendation first, and then maybe I can come up with I can think of a story in time to that backs up with this recommendation, is essentially to talk to as many people as you can, right? If you're interested in space, add 1,000 people on LinkedIn that work in the space industry. Maybe 10% of them, 20% of them will add you. And of those, maybe, again, 10-20% of those will actually have the availability and interest to actually have a chat with you, right? So that's going to be a good pool of, 20 to 100 people that you can speak with, who will then become your mentors, your advisors, potential customers, partners, investors potentially as well, right? It's essentially that there's no shortcut. You're not gonna build something and have it take off, most likely, unless you're like Elon Musk and you have a few $1 billion lying around, which maybe some people do have here today. But the reality is, even in that situation, it's very, very easy to go and build something that no one actually wants. It's much, much better and much, much more important to actually go and speak with as many people as possible in order to understand what is actually relevant, what would be useful. Now, in terms of why this is important from our own history, is at Spiral Blue, we developed space edge computing as a product that we ourselves would use. And so as a result, we didn't necessarily go to that level of, I guess, speaking with as many people as we should have, really. We spoke with 5-10 people, and they generally said it seemed like a decent idea, so we sort of went with it. And really, the lesson there for us was that initially, when we were speaking to these people who might have been customers, we really got the feedback of, well, this sounds fairly simple. I mean, we could probably build that ourselves. Why would we buy from Spiral Blue? Like, what do you guys have to prove, right? And so that sort of discouraged me. I thought, well, okay, no one's going to buy these computers. Maybe there's some other sort of business plan or some other strategy we can come up with to develop the company further. And we did that. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, can we put space edge computers on different types of satellites and collect data and develop an app store, or like a AWS in space, infrastructure as a service model? Can we develop something like this? And it's, these ideas, as soon as you add as a service to any sort of label, investors start to get very excited, right? But then ultimately investors ask, well, okay, who's going to be using this? What's the value that they're getting? Can you show us customers? Can we speak to customers? And in that situation, we were talking to customers who, again, were like, okay, this sounds interesting. And sure, this is not something we can build, because what you're now proposing is a piece of infrastructure, not a product that you'd be selling us. This is something that we'd be using on a as we go basis. So it seemed like there'd be plenty of people who are interested. But the lesson ultimately was that, yes, people are interested, but there was not the concrete proof of product market fit, even problem solution fit, really. What problem were we realistically solving for these customers? Or even on the other side, was the solution so difficult to use for these customers that it just wasn't practical, right? And so these problems started to come about. We started to see as well that the partners that we were developing to put some of these ideas in space, they were not coming on board. And when a partner is not coming on board, when they tell you a price that is so high to use their products or services, that it's just impossible for any startup to be able to afford that. That's basically them telling you to go away in diplomatic speak, right? And so we started to see that, and ultimately what we had to do was we were doing a lot of fundraising activities, going out and raising funds to build this idea, this concept of app stores and essentially server clusters in space to run infrastructure as a service in space, all this kind of things. And what we didn't realize was, well, we've gone to all this effort to build this amazing piece of kit, which if you go on our website, you'll see pictures of it. And we actually invested in putting it in space and showing it that it was working. And what we completely missed was that people didn't really want to use that on someone else's satellite. They wanted to put it on their own satellite so they could deliver the mission that they cared about. Right? We completely missed that because we didn't talk to enough people at the right time. And so again, if we had gone back and spoken more with the people who previously said, well, we can just build that ourselves. If we'd spoken more to them, maybe we would have found that they were saying this because we didn't have the track record at the time. We didn't have the flight heritage. And by flight heritage, I mean we hadn't shown that we, either as a team nor as a company, had flown anything in space. So what guarantee was there that we'd be able to deliver something, right? That didn't exist. Another factor is we weren't considering that, sure, maybe they could build something, but if we put it at the right price point, we can always make it at a price point where if they invest their time and their resources to build it, it's going to be uneconomical for them ultimately, right? If something costs $1 to build, but then on the other hand, you think, well, maybe we could build it ourselves. If you do the calculations and you realize that it's going to cost you $10 to build yourself, and not just build, but to prove out that it works, it's obviously going to make sense that you're going to buy the widget for $1, right? So we need to make this case more clearly to customers. We need to get out there. We need to speak to more people. So, I mean, this is the lesson I gave of going out and talking to more people in order to understand really how you can best get involved. It's a lesson that applies to us as much as any startup. And it's really something that has to be done on an ongoing basis. This is really the lesson I would give to everyone because it's a lesson I'm giving to myself.
Thank you so much, Taofiq, and that's a great point around validation, testing, and speaking to many people, because this is something that we've seen time and time again, and not just in the space industry, but in many different sectors where particularly us engineers, and I sort of count myself in that, we go ahead and we actually try and build something, and then, trying to find who the customers are rather than actually trying to figure out a problem and then solving the problem. So great advice of speaking to as many people as possible. Emeline, I'm going to actually pair up two questions to ask you, if you're okay with that. So the first one is actually something that's come in the chat, which is specifically around, this issue of space debris, and the fact that we've got so many satellites that are now sort of being launched. And so Banidas, who's actually in the chat, is asking, when will our space basically be crowded enough with infinite number of satellites, or what will be that happening then, and then when we'll actually have to stop. And so do you want to answer that question and then maybe follow that up with your thoughts on the ecosystem, space tech ecosystem in Australia and New Zealand, as well as some opportunities that exist for founders? So I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but if you want to start with the space debris question first and then go speak about the ecosystem after, that will be fantastic.
Yeah. So, just as a disclaimer, I am not an expert on this particular topic. I just wanted to point out that yes, it is actually a big issue right now, that we are sending a lot of satellites and spacecraft at the moment, but without actual specific regulations, especially now that we've got more commercial activities as well, because most of the regulations and policies that have been created decades ago were all normally ones that were for nation states, and at that and those, like, the Outer Space Treaty to the Moon Treaty, and all these were all created when, at a time when we thought that we were just going to be, nations are going to be reliable or liable for all of the things that we put up in space. But now that commercial spaces has happened, there's a lot more that's happening. I think policies and regulations are lagging behind in terms of needing those checks and balances that need to happen. But being a very positive person, or like I'm always thinking that we are actually going to overcome all of these problems that we have, both on the policy side and on the technical side, because as we have new technology that's happening, there's also a trend of companies that are actually being birthed just specifically to focus on debris removal, either on a passive debris removal, where, for example, you actually put components on new satellites to be able to deorbit them, and hoping that at some point in time we would have a policy where every single satellite that actually gets put up will have a deorbit mechanism to come down. So there's that. Then there's legacy satellites and spacecraft that are already been up there, and they're already dead and are debris. And now there are companies today that are actually working on active removal. So like there's ones have demonstrated like harpoons to even nets, and so there's many different types of companies now all over the world that are working on this particular like problem. So again, I think that one way or the other, we're actually going to get over this problem, where we will not get to what they're calling the Kessler syndrome, where we potentially will not be able to, we'll be trapped by our own kind of the debris that we put up there. So that's, I guess, my answer to the first part of your question.
So just on that note, I know you mentioned Kessler syndrome. Before we move on to the ecosystem question, Taofiq, is there anything you want to add to this as well, the space debris part of the question?
Yeah, happy to. I think one thing with space debris is the visual representations for space debris are very misleading. Now, to be fair, like it is hard to represent. But yes, if you show 34,000 1-kilometer sized dots around the Earth, it's going to look very crowded, right? But you can look at the Earth from space, from the, you've got a nice photo of the Earth from the Moon. You're not going to obviously see anything because these are very, very tiny objects, and they're all sort of whizzing by each other at high speeds all the time. Yes, and there is 100% a risk, and it is a risk that satellite operators, NASA, space agencies do take into account. But I think in many cases it is a bit overhyped. Now, it is overhyped. I'd say the biggest reason it is overhyped is because we don't know where everything is in space, right? We don't have the right technology or right algorithms, whatever the right mix is, I don't know, to know exactly where everything is in space, right? If you think about it in this way, imagine there are 34,000 objects on the surface of the Earth, right? Now, the surface of the Earth is just the land surface of the Earth is 150 million square kilometers, right? And so now, if we divide that by, and I love doing math, so you'll have to bear with me. If we divide that by the number of objects, that means for each object, there is 4,000 square kilometers of area for each object to live within. And, you would have to travel hundreds of kilometers to see any of the object at any one time, right? And this is assuming all the objects are on the flat surface, or not the flat, the round surface of the Earth. Space also has height. So there's a lot of room for different things to sort of whiz by each other. Yes, there are close calls. Yes, we need the technology to know better what's happening in space and where. And there are a number of Australian companies, especially that are doing really good work on this. And I think that this is an issue that we will, as Emeline said, before it becomes a serious issue, I think we will have the ability to not have it be an issue.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Taofiq. And one thing I'll add is that there are sort of, some of the solutions that you're talking about in terms of debris removal or even deorbiting satellites and so on. There's also been some really interesting kind of ways or roundabout ways in which you can reduce space debris. And I want to call out one Australian startup called Arlula. And what they're doing is really interesting, which is to be able to utilize the kind of spare time for different satellites, if you will. So satellites that are already up there, they have a specific mission, but then when they're not doing that mission, then that company helps hire you or anyone really a spot on that satellite to be able to look at the Earth or do whatever you want to do. And again, I'm trying to be non-technical here to then really look at how do you actually use that data to solve whatever problem you want to solve, right? So you don't necessarily have to launch a satellite if you are getting into the space sector at the moment. Emeline, over to you, building on that, particularly around the ecosystem in Australia and New Zealand that you've seen, because I know you worked across both countries, as well as some opportunities you see for founders. And then I'll go back to some of the questions that we're seeing in the chat as well.
Yeah. And again, apologies if probably I know more about the New Zealand kind of like ecosystem than Australia, although I have basically been looking at the trends on both sides. So yeah, I think now is a great time to be in the space industry, actually for both countries. I think for one, having like both space agencies that are really focused on commercial space, I think on both sides, is really great for startup companies today. And there's for sure also there's differences between the two. So for example, in Australia, there's a lot more funding that's kind of like available. I didn't realize this, that like since 2016, there's already like $20 billion that have been kind of like focused on the industry in Australia, while in New Zealand we're a little bit less in terms of funding, but at least like today there's about like $9 million that's actually been allocated for partnerships between NASA activities with New Zealand. So that's kind of like one thing. The other thing as well is that both also now are either have already or are working on launch capabilities, both on having like launch sites. So in New Zealand, of course, there's the Mahia Peninsula where Rocket Lab is already working on. But then in Australia now, I think there's at least 3 launch sites that are being prepared, and now also have some customers as well as launch companies. So yes, there's also in New Zealand, there's Rocket Lab, but there's also Dawn Aerospace as well that is now also testing on a space plane development. While in Australia, there's I guess Gilmore Space, and I'm sure there's even more. And this is important because essentially for any startup company that wants to either test their capabilities or like space proof or space qualify their hardware, this becomes even easier when you've got like launch capabilities and also launch pads to actually do them. So that's another thing. I think one thing I would also note is just some of the trends that are happening kind of like on both sides. I mentioned already launch development, component manufacturing is one where like at least in New Zealand as well, there's some companies that are really focusing on not the actual satellite itself, but just components that could potentially be uniquely positioned to be kind of like the standard, for example, for the rest of the world. Data analysis is one that is something that I'm actually not sure why it's not more out there and popular, and like of course like what Spiral Blue is doing, because in essence it's the lowest hanging fruit. All you really need right now is a computer and a Wi-Fi. I know that's totally simplified, but I'm just like talking to the crowd here, just like saying that today, it used to be so expensive to get like data, and then it's also very expensive to use like data analysis software to kind of like analyze the data. But today, there are open source data now coming from governments, and there's open source also platforms that can analyze the data. So I think that's something that with very little capital, it's one thing that people can kind of like gravitate to and look what the opportunities are. So certainly I think that's one thing to look at. And again, on both sides, I think Australia and New Zealand, like the ease of business or the ease of creating businesses compared to a lot of other countries is actually phenomenal. And so here, within several hours in New Zealand, you can actually create your own LLC for like $200 something. And so it's much easier than some of the countries in the rest of the world. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunities that's happening with funding, also traditional investors now. This is one thing that we've just seen a trend from maybe just the past 2 years, where traditional investors are now investing in space startups, where it used to be to them is too risky, but now it's slowly getting into the mainstream, that it's now attracting even traditional investors, and also a diversity of investors as well.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Emeline, and then I'll sort of come back to you and ask a question around that investor ecosystem in a bit. But one of the questions in the chat is from Carol, who's asked what type of standards and regulations are you using for space innovation? And so, Taofiq, given you're based in Australia, and sort of, I'm sure have had to deal with lots of different things, particularly, actually physically launching hardware in space, as well as, all the other kind of work you're doing in the sector. So we'd love to hear from you if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we employ many lawyers, let's just say, not directly. We, of course, contract them. We're not big enough to keep them on staff, at least so far. We do have Donald Lawler, who is, I'd say, the foremost commercial space lawyer in Australia, who we engage with on a regular basis. We're also working with some private commercial lawyers as well. And so, yeah, altogether, we make sure that we are across our regulatory requirements. And in terms of space, these are not something that you can imagine and they will go away. They are very stringent requirements. And particularly they relate to actually, I'd say 3 areas. The first most difficult area that you will often find in working in anything in space, especially in Australia, but essentially outside of anywhere but the United States, is the majority of the space industry is inside the United States. But everywhere outside of the United States has to deal with the fact that the people inside the United States can't really talk about their technology because it all falls under what they call ITAR, which stands for International Trafficking and Arms Regulations. And essentially what that means is any piece of space tech in the United States is seen as a weapon. And as a result, given this classification, people are absolutely terrified to talk about anything related to space outside of the United States, especially technology related, because they are terrified of being hit with multi-million-dollar fines, put in jail, all of the usual things for being treasonous against your country. So that's a massive concern, and so. For anyone looking to start with space, Australia is good in that regard, that you don't have to deal with ITAR if you're not working with the United States. If you do want to work with the United States, be aware that people will, just do this. They will just stop talking as soon as they realize you're not American. But that there are ways to get in. Obviously, it is expensive, and I don't recommend people try to do that as their first sort of step. But that's something to be aware of. And then the other 2 primarily relate to the launch of satellites. The first is you do need go-ahead from the Australian Space Agency to launch, unfortunately. And the reason for this is fairly simple. Any object in space that belongs to an Australian entity, if it hits something or someone, given the very high speeds and the massive potential for damage in space, imagine if someone hits the International Space Station. That's a $100 billion loss, right? It's actually ridiculous. Or imagine something comes down and hits Joe Biden on the back of the head. What's the loss there, right? It's astronomical, pun not intended. And so in that situation, the Australian government is actually required to step in and cover the loss, any such losses that can happen. And so because the Australian government doesn't want to be liable for infinite losses, they do require some pretty strict regulations around looking at what you're launching. Does it comply with space debris requirements? Does it comply with other requirements and this sort of thing? So that's something to be aware of. Another thing is, of course, if you're launching a satellite into space, you don't want to cause a blackout of GPS and mobile phone communications in a part of the world because you're transmitting data down, right? So you need to be across the ACMA, the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the International Telecommunications Union, the FCC in the United States, Federal Communications Commission. All of these different multi-letter bodies need to know what you're launching, when you're launching it, what it's going to be doing, and what your plan is to make sure that you're not causing disruption to other people's lives, right? So these are all concerns. We have so far managed to avoid most of these, at least having to tackle these head on, because number one, we don't work that much with the United States. We'd like to, but it's just not possible at this point. We're not launching our own satellites. So we don't have to necessarily get the launch permits from the Australian Space Agency. And in fact, everything that we've launched so far has not actually belonged to us. We've actually sold it to customers. And so the customers are ultimately liable for any edge computing units hitting someone in the back of the head. So that's how you have to run a company. It's as simple as that. You need to obviously be aware of regulations and be aware of the reason that they exist. So ultimately, regulations don't exist to stifle innovation. They exist to ensure safety. And so if you recognize that, and you take the approach of ensuring safety, assuring mission success at all times, and trying to comply with the guidelines, whether they be required or not required, it's generally fine. It's certainly, I will say this, last thing I will say, it is much less regulated than biotech, which I personally would not touch with a 10-foot pole in terms of just how much can go wrong and how protected that industry is.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
absolutely, go for it, Emeline.
Yeah, just the point about dealing with the U.S. I think one positive though of being in New Zealand and Australia is that it's part of the Five Eyes. So which means that there's this collaboration between these particular nations with the U.S., which would then be much easier to do things than if you were from a different country.
Thank you so much, Taofiq, and thanks also, Emeline, for adding your thoughts as well. I know you've had to deal with working in the US and obviously now working in New Zealand, so thank you for that perspective as well. But Emeline, I've got another question in the chat from Niesh, I think I'm pronouncing that name right, who is asking, how can we use SpaceTech for reducing carbon footprint? And I think that's something that kind of sits right in front of some of the work that you're doing with Space Planet Earth Challenge, but even beyond that, what are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier that one of the space challenges that we did was actually looking at carbon sequestration. Yeah, just like depending on the type of satellites that are up there, there are certain satellites that can actually measure carbon from space. And so there are many techniques and ways to make sure that that can be quantified. It's just that there are different ways of like looking at it. So, for example, in the challenge that we had, like knowing how like counting trees and knowing that trees can actually absorb carbon is one way, kind of like of looking at it. So yeah, there's many ways of being able to leverage satellite data depending on the instrument to be able to quantify carbon, which can then be used for like some of this like trading schemes today, where if you know how much carbon is being sequestered, for example, by your farm, then there's a potential for getting credits for it. So this is kind of like why it's very important as well to know what those quantities are.
Thanks very much, Emeline. Thanks for sharing that. And I know that the work that you're doing for Space for Planet is really fantastic, particularly now with measuring methane emissions in the sort of current year's challenge. And I can see Eric Dahlstrom, who is your co-founder for SpaceBase as well, in the chat, in the comments, actually helping out and answering some questions. So thank you, Eric, for doing that. And for anyone who's interested, the StartSpace team has kindly put in the link for the SpaceBase challenges as well, so you can go and have a look and apply. That could be your first step of getting involved in this sector. I know there's been a question that's been asked around by Deanna, which is around what tips do you have to get into the field of astronomy and space? And Taofiq, I want to ask you this, but I'll add that many people oftentimes look at space as kind of like a deep tech industry with like rockets and satellites. And I know we've talked about it a little bit, but for many people who might not even be technical, what are some of the ways in which they can get involved in space tech or this ecosystem?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the first half of that question.
So the first half is just any tips you have for people who want to get into astronomy or space or this sector.
Yeah. I think it can be very easy to see space as you said, like something that's just rockets and satellites, and oh my god, how would we build something like that? The fact is, any complex system, when broken into its parts, suddenly looks very simple, right? And this goes for even the greatest breakthroughs that humanity has produced. You look at the light bulb. Thomas Edison tried thousands of different materials, and the one that did it and the one that got him his patent and had a successful light bulb that worked for 1,000 hours was ultimately Japanese bamboo carbonized in a certain way, right? And it just sounds ridiculous. Like, wait, hang on. So you're saying all he needed to do was find this one species of bamboo, pull some fibers off and burn it a little bit and put it inside a little vacuum chamber and then run electricity through it. And that's what created General Electric, right? That's the thing, right? And it was like, oh my God, at that time, light bulbs off. That's impossible. No, gas is going to be the way to do it. You're never going to get a light bulb that works for more than 20 hours. I'm sure was the story at the time. And so my point is that deep tech, space, whatever industry you are in, whatever industry that you are interested in, and this goes for AI as well, right? Anything can be broken down into a very simple, like a complex combination of simple items, simple components, right? And so it's really starting that component level and then building your way up that I believe is the key. At Spiral Blue, that's essentially what we're doing. We're not fundamentally what we're building is not very complex, but it is still incredibly valuable for the missions that we are flying on, and thus we are seeing some small successes so far. We do intend to launch our own satellites, capture data on the Earth for applications such as addressing climate change, as Emeline talked about. Carbon sequestration is a massive area of interest. But again, like, we were a space company. How the hell do we work in carbon sequestration? We don't know anything about that. Just again, everything can be broken down into a series of smaller problems. And the way to look at it is that so I'll address you. Yes, that's you. I'm talking to you right now. The hypothetical audience member. Sure, you're not going to know everything about this area that you may be interested in. That's why you don't work alone. You work with a team. You pull in friends, you pull in family, you pull in colleagues, fellow students, whoever they may be around you, and you focus on different areas so that you master different things in different ways, right? I did an aerospace engineering degree. I barely do any technical work anymore because that's the area where I've fallen into, right? Similar for my panel members, I suspect, and that's what happens because we've gone out and found people to work with who are smarter than us, and so obviously, why would we do technical things when we have people to work with who are much smarter than us and are more capable than us, right? And so I think it comes down to yes, looking at the problem in a series of small components, but also getting and working with the right people so that you're not just banging your head against a wall, you're banging your head against a wall with multiple other people, and maybe one of them finds a weakness and suddenly the wall is broken.
Thank you so much, Taofiq, and I love the analogy that you gave of the light bulb, and how to think about it. And oftentimes, things that seems too complex or seem impossible, we've already done that in our history and in the past, and it's always happened. Whether the printing press or electricity or trains, like any of these things that we just take for granted today, even the internet, right, are things that have just seemed impossible. And so, really, for many people, even if you're not technical, you can have a team, you can have other people who can support you. But I know there's a question by Love in Life by MJ in the chat, which is asking this question around what are some of the areas of space tech that you think would be interesting to create a startup in. And Emeline, I'm going to sort of throw that over to you, but also add that component from the previous question around, for people particularly who are not technical, what are some of the things that you could see them doing, and what are some interesting maybe examples you've seen, with that are not like technical focus specifically.
Yeah, so let me answer that first part yet of like for those who are non-technical, and I think it's really to simplify it. Basically, the space industry is just like any other industry, and the companies in the space industry are just like any other companies. So the fact that we do need the engineers and the scientists and the physicists within that company, you also need the lawyers, the marketing and salespeople, the business managers, the entrepreneurs, the fundraisers, because everybody, you need a full kind of like a full team that has all of those characteristics that you'll need to have a sustainable company. And so there's a lot of opportunities for anybody who's really interested in space but doesn't necessarily want to go through like the sciences to be able to be part of the industry. And so and again, coming back to that, that space is not defined as rockets and spaceships. It's really the whole of that supply chain is the opportunity, from life sciences all the way to space law, everything. There is an opportunity for everybody to be able to kind of like work on what they're actually passionate about. So I think especially because also today you can think of the space industry as a terrestrial industry that is actually applied to extreme environments. And so we're just extending that terrestrial company, whether you're a manufacturing company, you're just like manufacturing for extreme environments, which unfortunately right now we are kind of like heading into extreme environments because of climate change. And hoping that that's not really the case kind of like in the future, but that's sort of like where we're going. And so if you're working towards that, then you're also going to be helping terrestrially what is happening kind of on Earth as opposed to on space. So that's sort of like, I guess, my answer to that first bit. In terms of the question about what space tech or areas you should be focusing on, I think again we talked about space for planet Earth. So my appeal to people is first to think about what are the big problems on Earth today. What are the grand challenges that we're seeing that you can leverage space technology for, either abundant energy that could potentially be derived from space, and then being back on Earth. I mean, that's just one example, but it's better to kind of like look at the problem in itself and try to find a solution for it, as opposed to loving the tech and finding an application for the tech. Which unfortunately, a lot of there's a lot of that happening in Silicon Valley, where you're kind of like, you're just loving the tech and not really thinking about the applications. But I also wanted to kind of like just maybe point out the trends that I'm seeing, at least that's happening within New Zealand and Australia, where there's like, of course, there's space plane, which is sort of, I think, the holy grail of either both space and aviation, that's happening. There's component manufacturing. I talked about data analysis. There's space power beaming. So that's another one that I talked about, where if you can harness it from space and beam it down, that might kind of like help us with the resource issues. Green or on-orbit propulsion, which is also happening. Like, there's several space companies, specifically in New Zealand, that's doing this today. One thing that's also an asset that I think is defensible for Australia and New Zealand is ground stations. I think ground stations are, because they are or New Zealand and Australia are in an area where ground stations are most important, especially for polar orbiting satellites. It's something that is an asset. I talked about component manufacturing as well. We talked about also with the space debris, space situational awareness is one that both Australia and New Zealand are especially working on, and is something that is very important with the problems that we've been talking about with debris.
Thank you so much for mentioning some great opportunities, Emeline. And again, I'll sort of shout out another Australian startup called Hero Robotics. They're based in Sydney. You might be able to see what they're doing. Very interesting. It's above my understanding to understand all the complexities, but they are also utilizing existing satellites, sometimes in the geostationary orbit, to be able to look at other satellites and understand, maintenance issues, right? And what kind of predictive maintenance they can look at using AI and algorithms. So there's so much opportunity, and so like when you start to peel the layers of the onion, you really get to understand that there are many problems that you can think of, particularly interesting problems, as Emeline, you were mentioning, that you can really solve using space tech. But don't start with space, or don't start with technology. Start with the problem. So I think that's something that both of the panelists have said today. We've got one last question that I'm going to ask before we wrap up, and before I ask you for a wrap up question. So Latif has asked about any advice on getting funding in space tech. So can I ask both of you to maybe answer that question in 2 minutes each, around your thoughts and your experiences of funding in space tech? Taofiq, do you want to go first, and then I'll come to you, Emeline, because I know you work with investments and VC funds as well.
Yeah, I think with funding in space tech, it's any sort of funding is always going to be a question of you're essentially asking someone to part with their hard-earned money, right? Or maybe it's not hard-earned, but they'll certainly feel it's hard-earned at the very least. And so you have to present a very good case as to why you're going to take that money, and then after a period of some years, you're going to give them much more than they put in, right? And that ultimately means having the more bulletproof you can make your case, the easier a time you'll have in raising. So there's multiple variables to this. Probably the first variable to consider is who are you as a person, right? Investors will, fortunately for investors, unfortunately for many of us, will prefer people who have had previous expertise or experience in the area that they're working in. So for myself, I started working on Spiral Blue right after graduation, so that's not a factor that helps me, right? But someone like Emeline with literal decades of experience in the field, if she was doing a startup and was asking for investment, anyone's going to be paying attention because like, oh wow, okay, she's been working in this area for how long and she's been talking to how many people. She definitely has something up her sleeve, right? So that's one factor. Another factor is obviously same goes for your team, but then the factors after that are, again, how many people have you talked to? How many customers do you have? And especially for space, customers don't necessarily have to mean they are paying you, they contracted, this sort of thing. It could just mean that they are supporting you. You can demonstrate that you've been talking to them over a period of time. Ideally, they've signed some paperwork saying that they're interested in what you're building. Most ideally in that situation, they're willing to say how much or how many units they'll be willing to buy, right? The more of these numbers that you can demonstrate, the stronger your business case will look, right? Imagine you're proposing a cafe to a bank. It's the same case you have to make, just with a different business, right? So that's one factor. The other factor, and this is the final factor, is how many buyers are you going to, right? Ultimately, you're looking to sell shares in your company, you're looking to sell an asset, and you have to reach as many people as you can, because not everyone is going to believe that that asset is worth anything. Even publicly traded companies, it's not like everyone buys shares in Google or Tesla or Amazon, even though these are very large companies. There are many people who believe that these companies will fail, and so they don't buy those shares. But they have engaged with enough people and obviously shown enough trust that many people do buy their shares, and so the value of the company is quite high. It's going to be the same. You need to demonstrate your worth, your value, the work that you've done to as many people as possible. If that means talking to 100 people, 1,000 people, that's the unfortunate reality.
Emeline, do you want to share some thoughts from your side?
Yeah, Taofiq really did a great summary on what you kind of like need. But maybe just to add is that I think networks are really important. If you know the right people, and people that can either vouch for you or also people that you can ask for advice or the connections, that's, I think, a shortcut to really almost like like cold calling like all of these potential investors, angels, and so forth. So I think that's one thing that I would really recommend the most. But just also noting that today it's no longer just angels and investors that are there. There are like a diversity of companies or different types of investors, from banks to really private funders that you can now kind of like reach out to, which is really better than even just a few years ago.
Thank you both for that answer. And just with someone who's had a bit of an experience from a funding aspect as also can speak about this. I know, and by the way, just big disclaimer, the three of us, we are not financial advisors. So definitely get your own financial advice when you do go ahead and raise capital. I think it's important for us to say that. For me, I think one thing I'll add is, when you're thinking about particularly venture capital, you can think about, the things that make you a fantastic startup, will also be the things that will make you a fantastic SpaceTech startup. So I know Taofiq has mentioned this, having a really strong unit economics and the strong business model, not just hoping that because you're doing something in space or be something sexy that you'll get funded, or following your hype curve like AI or whatever. That's one thing. The second thing is having a great team, and the great team could be, lots of different ways in which you can show what a great team looks like, understanding and solving a problem, and then having access to that market and an opportunity, and then also showing that global market potential as well is something that normally VCs look for, and this is across any sector. And so when you think about SpaceTech, it's no different. In fact, the benefit you have is if you can prove out what you're doing is valuable and can work, is this is an area that is really high growth industry. And so there's a lot of opportunities for you to be able to sort of leverage that. And there are new funds that are focusing on this as well. But another thing that I want to mention is that funding doesn't just limit it to investors and venture capital. There's a lot of other types of funding that you can get. So, for example, grants, whether that's from government if you're doing R&D, and if you're looking at, for example, solving a social problem or environmental problem, there are other grants you can get from foundations, corporate partners, not-for-profit kind of grants as well. So think about it and be more creative when you're thinking about raising capital, and then what you're trying to get it for and how much funding do you need. Because if you're trying to build a rocket, you probably need a lot of money. If you're trying to build an analytics company, on a different kind of landscape. So it really depends. But yeah, it's a great question, and thank you both for sharing that. I know we're coming close to the end of time for this panel, so I'm going to ask a quick wrap-up question, and I'll incorporate a couple of things in there. So I would love for you to share a key success you've had on this journey so far, one key learning, and one key sort of takeaway or action that people can take as they go away. So I know people have been listening to you, sharing your journey and your experience in this industry, but one key success that you've had, one key learning, and then a takeaway or an action that someone can go and do tomorrow if they want to get involved in this sector. So I know, big question. If you can answer that in a minute, that will be fantastic. Taofiq, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think a key success for us was definitely getting a defense contract very early in our company's history. That said, I'll tie this into the so it was a success. It was the learning and the piece of advice, was it? That was the three things. Yeah. So the learning from that was, ironically, we got that contract. The person that gave us the contract left that job before we started working on the contract. The people that replaced him had no clue why we were there, but were required to give us the money. And so we were like, well, I mean, what do you want us to build? I was sort of like, whatever you want. So we built whatever we wanted, and obviously we enjoyed that. But ultimately, it meant that we had no follow-on work with that organization. And so my advice there would be, it's very easy to when you fail, it's very easy to look back and think, okay, well, I failed. What can I have done better? What was the feedback? Can I ask for feedback? This sort of stuff. It's arguably even more important, because people forget this. We forget this, to ask, why were we successful? Right? Why did I get this job? Why did I get this contract? Why did this team member join me? What's the reason for this success? Because if you know that, sure, you can avoid problems all you want, but if you're not doubling down on success, then ultimately you're not going to see more success.
That's great advice, and really going back to that point about reflection and thinking through, and sort of like what makes you super, what is your superpowers individually, but also as a team and as a startup. Emeline, over to you. One key success, one learning, and then a particular action that people can take from today.
All right, it's a tough call. So for me, because there's really not one specific success with SpaceBase. For us, as I mentioned, we're enablers. And so for me, looking at our journey over the past 5 years and seeing, I think, our impact like integrated into what has happened in New Zealand, in my humble opinion, I hope that we've actually made some impact where our success is actually the success of the people that we've actually helped. So that's sort of like for me the success factor. The other lesson learned is that basically I think don't be afraid to pivot, and when you're gonna fail in many different aspects of what you've been doing, and but don't be afraid to pivot if it's not working, or that it just makes sense to actually go in a certain direction. And then the last thing is, like, in terms of an actual actionable thing is, I think, know your market early, and also know that if you've got like a long-term goal, that there is steps between your long-term goal to what you're actually doing in the short term. You need to connect the dots to make sure that you ensure success.
Thank you so much, both of you for joining and for sharing your wonderful insights. I guess from my side, I'll share my one key success to be able to get the both inspiring speakers here today joining us and sharing all your knowledge and expertise. It's been really wonderful. My key kind of learning here is that, you know, all of us can take some action to be getting involved in this sort of sector. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your background is, but really, you know, we can do something about it. And then a key takeaway or a key action that I'll tell you is that there are great opportunities that you can do from tomorrow, from as simple as, you know, connecting with us on LinkedIn, to, you know, applying for the Space and Planet Earth Challenge, to looking at, you know, joining. I know Taofiq hasn't talked about it, but they do some fantastic space drinks in Sydney regularly. So there's an opportunity for you to join if you're based in Sydney. In Melbourne, there's other opportunities that sort of popping up every now and then. So really, there's lots and lots of opportunities. So key takeaway is you can take action, you can get involved. Doesn't matter what your background is, doesn't matter who you are. And we all really genuinely believe in supporting and being inclusive in this ecosystem. And we would love to help you and support you on this journey. Thank you so much once again for tuning in. I'm going to hand it over back to Roberto. Thanks, Roberto, for having us and for sort of facilitating this as well.
Thank you, Usman, for putting together this phenomenal panel. And thank you, Emeline and Taofiq. I mean, you really unpacked, you know, what was that series? Space, the new frontier for entrepreneurship. So you really unpacked that well. Interesting enough, I've seen, you know, a lot of the questions in the chat are about, okay, how do we get into this? And, you know, you can see the sort of the first ideas popping up. And this is where I link to a little promo for StartSpace, because you are our ideal candidate. So StartSpace is based in the State Library of Victoria, and we are a support service for early stage startup funders. So whether you're thinking about space, whether you're thinking about any kind of business, we are actually industry agnostic. So we're open to all walks of life and business. If you're Victorian, if you're sort of based in Victoria, if you're over 18, if you have any kind of early stage idea that you want to explore, okay, join StartSpace. We had a slide up for a second. If we could ask if we could have it back for a second. So join the thing. It's a free co-working space. So co-working space at no charge. We have free events, free workshop, mentoring programs, scholarship programs, and a really rich and dynamic community of founders. We are fortunate enough to have Usman also coming to visit often with us and experiencing the space. So I would invite you for the Victorian, for people who are Victorian, and if you're early stage, that's a great way to get started. You know, you don't want entrepreneurship to be a solo journey. You want to be part of a community, and we are fortunate enough to be able to offer that community, offer that environment for free. So once again, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, audience, for staying with us. I have one last ask for the audience. In the chat, in the comments on YouTube, you will now find a link to a survey. So please give us some feedback. It's very useful for me and for the team to do more events like this, different events or whatever. So we really, really appreciate if you could take 3 minutes of your time to give us some feedback. Having said that, our session's over. Usman, thank you a million times again. Taofiq, Emeline, thank you. And let's start thinking at a version 2 of this meetup and see what we can, how we can progress the conversation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, audience. To the next Inventors and Innovation series.